She didn't have a voice, hadn't had one since she was 14 years old, since the night she watched her mother die on a kitchen floor in Worcester and screamed until something inside her throat broke and never came back. Doctors said the vocal cords could heal. Her brain said no. That was 13 years ago. Now Wren Calloway was 27, 5'4", 93 pounds after a full meal she couldn't always afford, and she was kneeling on the wet concrete of Haymarket Square in Boston, picking through a crate of bruised tomatoes that a vendor had thrown out, because that's what dinner looked like when you worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent. She had a small notebook in her coat pocket that was her voice now, a pen and paper, and she'd learned to say everything she needed in as few words as possible, because people don't wait long for someone who can't speak. She had no family, no friends, no one who'd notice if she didn't come home tonight. What she did have was a pair of hands that a dead woman named Ruth Ann Porter had trained to stop bleeding, check pulses, and stitch wounds closed in rooms where no doctor would ever come, and a memory for numbers so precise she could read a balance sheet once and catch every lie hiding in it. She didn't know it yet, but in about 90 seconds, an elderly woman in a cashmere coat was going to collapse 6 feet behind her, and Wren's hands were going to save her life. She didn't know that the woman's name was Dorothy Ashford. She didn't know that Dorothy's son controlled half the port of Boston, owned 11 restaurants he'd never eaten in, and he'd buried more problems than the police would ever find. She didn't know that Connell Ashford, 37, cold-eyed, brutal when the situation required it, and quiet in a way that made brutal men nervous, had been looking for someone exactly like her for a very long time, though he didn't know it either. And she certainly didn't know that when Dorothy Ashford woke up in a hospital bed and looked at the silent girl who'd kept her heart beating on a sidewalk, the first thing she'd say wouldn't be thank you, it'd be something that'd change everything. You can come stay with me. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to that morning at Haymarket Square, where Wren Calloway had no idea her whole life was about to change. That sound came from behind her. It wasn't a scream, wasn't a call, but the sound of a body collapsing onto wet concrete, heavy and sudden, as though someone had cut the string holding that person upright. Wren turned around and saw an older woman lying on her side on the ground, her cream-colored cashmere coat soaking up dirty water from the market floor, one hand braced weakly against the pavement, the other clenched tight over her chest, as if she were trying to hold inside her something that was going dark. 2 men in black suits shoved their way toward her. One dropped to his knees and shouted her name. The other pulled out his phone, but his hand was shaking so badly he pressed the wrong buttons 3 times in a row. They were bodyguards. Wren understood that at once, but none of them knew what to do with a person who was stopping breathing. Wren was beside the woman before she had time to think. Her knees touched the ground for the second time that morning, but this time it wasn't because of crushed tomatoes. She loosened the woman's coat, undid the collar beneath it, laid her flat on her back on the ground, and tilted her head back to open the airway. Her hand searched for the pulse in the woman's neck, 2 fingers pressing gently against the thin skin beneath the jaw. Weak, irregular, slipping away. She didn't have a voice to shout for anyone. She pulled the notebook from her coat pocket, tore out a page, wrote 3 lines in the largest handwriting she could manage, and shoved it into the hand of the bodyguard kneeling closest to her. Aspirin. Now. Call 911. Do not move her. The man looked at the paper, looked at her, then looked back at the paper, as if he couldn't believe that a girl in an old coat, kneeling in the middle of the market, was giving him orders. But there was something in Wren's eyes, in her complete stillness while everyone around them was shouting, that made him get up and run. Wren began chest compressions. 30 presses, 2 breaths, counting silently in her head to the rhythm she had practiced hundreds of times on the floor at Ruth Ann Porter's house when she was a 16-year-old child training on a resuscitation doll. This time, it wasn't a doll. This time, the woman's ribs cracked beneath her hands, and Wren didn't stop because Ruth Ann had taught her that broken bones would heal, but a brain without oxygen would not. The second bodyguard came back with an aspirin tablet from the pharmacy stall at the front of the market. Wren placed the tablet beneath the woman's tongue, then kept pressing, kept counting, kept holding this body here while it wanted to leave. 7 minutes. The ambulance took 7 minutes to reach Haymarket Square that morning. 7 minutes in which Wren knelt on wet concrete and kept a stranger's heart beating with her bare hands. When the paramedics jumped out and placed the defibrillator pads on the woman's chest, one of them looked at Wren and asked what she had done. She wrote in her notebook, fast, Brief, precise, exactly the way Ruth Ann had taught her. Time of cardiac arrest, number of compression cycles, aspirin under the tongue, pulse weak but returned at the 4th minute. The paramedic read it and said something to his partner that Wren would never forget, even though she couldn't repeat it. 5 more minutes and we would have lost her. They lifted the woman onto the stretcher, and when the stretcher began rolling toward the ambulance, the woman's hand, the hand of a woman whose name Wren didn't know, found Wren's and held on. Not politely. She held on like someone who had nearly died and had just been pulled back, clinging to the thing that had pulled her. Wren looked at the bodyguard. He looked back at her, not knowing what to say. She climbed into the ambulance with the woman because the woman wouldn't let go of her hand, and because Wren Calloway had never once in her life been held that tightly by anyone. The ambulance drove down Atlantic Street, turned onto Cambridge Street, and stopped in front of the emergency entrance of Massachusetts General Hospital. The woman was taken into the emergency room, under white fluorescent lights, into the noise of machines and nurses calling to one another. Wren stood in the corner, her old coat stained with dirt from the market floor, her knees scraped, her hand still marked by the pressure of the woman's grip. She didn't belong here. She knew that. But when the woman was stabilized and opened her eyes, the first eyes she searched for weren't the doctors, weren't the bodyguards, but the eyes of the girl standing in the corner as if she wanted to disappear. The woman lifted her hand, trembling, and Wren stepped closer. The woman took her hand again, and this time the grip was softer. Not the grip of someone afraid of dying, but the grip of someone making a memory. Wren sat down beside the bed, the woman's hand still in hers. And she didn't know that the woman holding her hand was Dorothy Ashford, that 17 minutes earlier someone had called her son, and that her son was already on his way here, bringing with him everything Wren had never prepared herself to face. Connell Ashford was sitting at the head of the conference table, on the 42nd floor of the building in the financial district, when Neil's phone vibrated against the glass. He never took calls in the middle of a meeting. 18 years of running an empire had taught him that anything that couldn't wait 30 minutes was something he needed to hear alone, not in front of 12 people. But Neil never called unless he had to call, and on the screen were 2 words Connell had never wanted to read: mother. Hospital. Connell stood up in the middle of the presenter's sentence. No apology, no explanation, no look back. He walked out, and the door closed behind him, and not one of the 12 people in that room dared ask when he would return, because they knew Connell Ashford wasn't the kind of man you questioned. Neil already had the car waiting downstairs. On the way to Mass General, he spoke briefly. Heart attack, Haymarket, stabilized, someone performed first aid on site. Connell didn't ask anything more. He sat still in the back seat and watched Boston slide past the window, holding everything inside him in its proper place, because he had learned how to do that at 19, when they called him to the morgue to identify his father's body. He walked into the hospital room and saw his mother. She was lying in a white bed, an IV line in the back of her hand, the heart monitor blinking steadily. She looked smaller than he remembered, or perhaps this was the first time he had allowed himself to admit it. But what made Connell stop at the door wasn't the machines or the wires. It was the girl sitting beside his mother's bed. She was young, in her 20s maybe. Her old coat was stained with something wet. Her knees were scraped, and her hair hadn't been brushed. She sat on the plastic hospital chair with the posture of someone who wasn't used to being given a seat anywhere, back straight, legs together, taking up as little space as possible, as if she were trying to exist without bothering anyone. And his mother was holding her hand. Dorothy Ashford, the woman who hadn't let anyone but her son touch her since the day her husband took 3 bullets on the harbor 18 years earlier, was holding the hand of a strange girl in cheap clothes, and she was smiling. Connell couldn't remember the last time his mother had smiled at a stranger. Maybe she never had. She saw him at the door, and the smile didn't vanish. It only changed, gaining some new layer he couldn't read right away. She said, her voice weak but clear, "Son, this is the girl who saved my life." She looked at Wren, then back at Connell. She can't speak. Connell looked at Wren. She didn't look back at him. She was gently pulling her hand out of Dorothy's, slowly and carefully, as if she were afraid pulling away too quickly would hurt her. She stood, picked up the small notebook from her lap, and began backing toward the door with the steps of someone who was used to leaving every place before anyone had time to tell her to go. She thought she was finished here. Her job had been to keep Dorothy alive, and Dorothy was alive, and now there were doctors and there was her son, and Wren no longer had any reason to sit in that plastic chair. Dorothy said, "Wait," And Wren stopped. She looked at Connell with the eyes he knew were the eyes she used when she had already decided something, and nothing in the world would change it. She said, "She's here with me." Connell nodded to his mother, not because he agreed, but because he never argued with his mother in a hospital. He looked at Wren a second time. She still didn't look at him. She had returned to Dorothy's bedside, because Dorothy had told her to stay, and she was writing something in the small notebook, tilting it so Dorothy could read, and when his mother finished reading, she smiled again, twice in 10 minutes. Connell stepped into the hallway. Neil was standing beside the door, arms folded, waiting. Connell looked through the glass into the hospital room, where the nameless girl was writing something else, and his mother was reading, and she looked like a woman who had just found something that the most powerful mafia boss in New England, with all his money and power, hadn't been able to buy for her in 18 years. Without turning his head, his voice steady and low, the way it always was when he gave an order, he said to Neil, "Run a background check on her. Everything. Before tonight." Neil nodded and pulled out his phone. Connell remained standing there a little longer, looking through the glass, and the girl inside the hospital room finally lifted her head, not to look at him, but to look at Dorothy, and she wrote something else that made his mother raise a hand to cover her mouth and laugh so hard her shoulders shook. Connell turned away. But he turned away more slowly than he wanted to admit. Dorothy Ashford wasn't the kind of woman who lay still in a hospital bed without observing. 68 years of living in this world, 18 of them as the widow of an assassinated boss, had taught her that people lied with their mouths but told the truth through their habits. So she didn't ask Wren much during the first 2 days. She only watched. She watched the way Wren sat in the plastic chair beside her bed for the entire first day without getting up, unless Dorothy told her to go eat. She watched the way Wren stepped into the hallway and came back 15 minutes later with a loaf of bread from the vending machine on the ground floor, the $2.50 kind, and ate it slowly, as if she wanted it to last a few more hours. She watched Wren's phone, the old flip phone lying in her lap for 2 straight days without vibrating once, without lighting up once, without a single message, without a single missed call, without anyone in this world calling to look for her. She watched the way Wren bought lunch on the second day, this time from the hospital cafeteria, and counted change from the pocket of her coat, lining each coin across her palm and counting twice before handing it to the cashier. And Dorothy watched the way she tucked the remaining coins back into her pocket, with the carefulness of someone who knew exactly where every coin had to go, because there wasn't a single one she could afford to lose. On the afternoon of the second day, Dorothy took the little notebook from Wren's hand, wrote a question with her own hand, and gave it back to her. She wrote, "Tell me about your life." Wren looked at the question, then she wrote beneath it, her handwriting round, neat, without one unnecessary stroke. "Live alone, Dorchester, 2 jobs. I'm fine." Dorothy read those 4 lines, and she knew, with the instinct of a woman who had read thousands of lies in her lifetime, that the first 3 lines were true, and the last line was the greatest lie this girl had ever written. "I'm fine." Those 2 words carried the weight of 13 years without a voice. 7 foster families that hadn't kept her, a teacher who had died, and 2 jobs that still weren't enough to pay rent on the cheapest apartment in Dorchester. Dorothy didn't write anything more in the notebook. She only folded that page, kept it, and looked out the hospital room window for a long while. On the 3rd day, the doctor discharged Dorothy from the hospital. Connell came to pick up his mother that morning with Neil and a black car parked directly in front of the emergency entrance. Wren had already tidied everything around Dorothy's hospital bed, folded the blanket, arranged the bags, placed the flowers someone had sent into a paper bag so they would be easier to carry. All of it done 10 minutes before Connell stepped into the room. She was standing by the door with her backpack on her shoulder, in the posture of someone preparing to leave, because that was the posture most familiar to her, always ready to step out before someone told her to. Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed, already wearing her coat, looked at Wren, then at Connell, then back at Wren, and she said, her voice as ordinary as though she were inviting the girl to tea rather than changing a stranger's life, "You can come home with me." Wren didn't move. She stood there with her backpack on her shoulder, and her eyes blinked once, twice, quickly, as though she were trying to process a language she had never heard before, the language of someone wanting her to stay. Dorothy added, "There are plenty of empty rooms. After this, I need someone beside me, and I want that someone to be you." Connell stood beside the window, his hands in his pants pockets, his face unchanged. He didn't object, not because he agreed, but because he knew that when his mother used that voice, the whole Ashford empire put together couldn't change her mind. Wren looked at Dorothy. Then she opened her notebook, wrote one word, and handed it to her. The word was, yes. The drive from Mass General to Beacon Hill took 12 minutes. Wren sat in the back seat beside Dorothy, her backpack on her lap, looking through the window at streets where she had never once set foot. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, she looked at the iron gate, the 3-story reddish-brown brick facade, the stone steps, the dark wooden door, and she didn't get out right away. She sat there for 3 more seconds, long enough for Neil to glance through the rearview mirror and see that she was looking at the house as if it were something that would vanish if she blinked. Connell led her through the main house, through the living room, through the kitchen, and out to the back. The room was in the rear wing, beside the garden. Small, clean, with a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, a window looking out over the wooden fence, and the maple tree that hadn't yet put out leaves. And there was a private door opening straight into the garden. Connell said, "This door lets you come and go freely, without passing through the main house. It's more convenient." He said it was for privacy. But Wren wasn't stupid, and Connell wasn't as good at lying as his mother. That private door was there so he could control who came in and who went out, and also so that if there was something wrong with her, she would be at the edge of the house, not inside it, not where all the important things of the Ashford family were kept. He didn't trust her yet. That made sense. No one who had lived 18 years in Connell's world would trust a stranger just because his mother told him to. Connell stepped out. The door closed. Wren stood in the middle of the room, alone, her backpack still on her shoulder. She looked around. The bed had white sheets. The desk had drawers. The wardrobe was empty. The window had curtains. The room was cleaner than any place she had slept since Ruth Ann died. She lowered the backpack from her shoulder. Slowly, with both hands, she set it beside the foot of the bed with the carefulness of someone setting down everything she owned in the world. And she knew that if tonight, or tomorrow, or next week, someone told her to leave, she would pick up that backpack and walk out through that private door without needing anyone to show her the way, because she always knew the way out. That was the first thing she learned in every place she entered. Neil placed the brown envelope on Connell's desk at 6 o'clock that evening, exactly as ordered, before nightfall. Connell didn't open it right away. He let it lie there while he ended a call, while he signed 2 documents, while he poured whiskey and sat back down in his chair. Then he opened it. The file was thinner than he had expected. People with many things to hide usually had thick files. Wren Calloway had a thin file because she almost didn't exist in any system at all. Wren Calloway, born in Worcester, Massachusetts. Mother, Janet Calloway, died when Wren was 14 years old, beaten to death by her boyfriend in the kitchen of their home. Perpetrator currently serving a life sentence at MCI Norfolk. Father, unknown. No name listed on the birth certificate. Wren entered the Massachusetts state foster care system the same year her mother died. 7 families in 4 years. 7 moves, 7 different addresses, 7 doors opened and then closed. Medical record. Mute. Diagnosed with functional conversion disorder caused by psychological trauma. Larynx damaged but capable of recovery. Brain refusing to reactivate speech function after the traumatic event. No treatment updates after the year she turned 18, which meant she aged out of the system and no one paid for doctors for her anymore, and she didn't have enough money to pay for them herself. Education. High school completion through the GED program. No college. No vocational certificate. Employment. Kitchen assistant at a restaurant in Dorchester. Morning shift. Minimum wage. Office cleaner for a cleaning company. Night shift. Paid hourly. No contract. Total annual income below the level required to pay federal taxes. Current address. A 4th floor walk-up studio in Dorchester. $1,100 a month. 2 months behind on rent. Bank account. 1 checking account only. Balance fluctuating between $40 and $160. No savings account. No credit card. No loans because no one would lend to her. Criminal record. None. Prior offenses. None. Emergency contact. Blank. Connell read the last page. The summary Neil had typed neatly at the bottom. No connection to any organization. No contact with any criminal group. No suspicious activity. Nothing at all. This girl was clean. Not clean in the way someone had carefully erased her tracks. Clean in the way there was nothing to erase. Connell closed the file. He said nothing. Neil stood there waiting, because Neil knew when Connell needed more information and when he needed to be left alone. This time, he needed to be left alone. Neil stepped out and closed the door. Connell sat in his office for a while longer, his hand resting on the sealed envelope, and he thought about the number 7. 7 foster families. 7 times a mute child had been moved from one house to another because no one had enough patience to keep a child who couldn't speak, or because no one wanted to enough. He thought about the walk-up studio and the $40 balance and the emergency contact line left blank, and he understood that blank didn't mean she had forgotten to fill it in. It meant there was no one in this world to put there. He left the office later than usual. The car reached the Beacon Hill mansion at 2 o'clock in the morning. The house was dark. Dorothy had gone to sleep long ago. She needed rest after being discharged from the hospital. Connell walked into the kitchen without turning on the main light, only switching on the small light over the counter, and he saw it. A plate of food on the table, sealed tightly with foil. Beside it, a neatly arranged pair of chopsticks and a spoon, a glass of water already poured, and a small piece of paper torn from the notebook, the handwriting round, even, careful, reheated at 11 o'clock, heat for 2 more minutes, if needed. Connell stood in front of the kitchen table, looking at that note. He had read thousands of financial reports, hundreds of intelligence files, dozens of verdicts and statements and pieces of paper that could change the fate of an entire family. But he stood before this small note, longer than necessary, not because its content was complicated, but because he couldn't remember the last time someone in this house, other than his mother, had left food for him at 2 o'clock in the morning, and known he would come home late, and known he would be hungry. He peeled back the foil, heated the plate of food for 2 minutes exactly as she had written, and sat down at the kitchen table to eat in silence. When he finished, he washed the plate, placed it upside down on the rack, and picked up the little note. He folded it carefully, along the crease, then put it into the pocket of his suit jacket. He turned off the kitchen light and went up the stairs, and he didn't know that this note wouldn't be the last one, and that the habit of folding them and tucking them into his pocket would follow him through many more nights, more than he could have guessed at 2 o'clock in the morning in the dark kitchen of a house whose breathing a mute girl had just quietly begun to change. During the first 2 weeks in the Beacon Hill mansion, no one arranged anything, but everything found its own place. Wren woke before everyone else in the house, before even the light touched the kitchen windows, because she had grown used to waking at 4:30 for 5 straight years to make it to her kitchen assistant shift at 5 o'clock, and her body didn't know how to sleep longer even when there was no longer any shift to reach on time. She wiped down the kitchen before anyone used it. She made porridge for Dorothy because Dorothy had just come home from the hospital and needed bland food, and she remembered that not because anyone had told her, but because Ruth Ann had taught her what heart patients needed in the first week. And Wren never forgot what Ruth Ann taught her. She washed dishes before they had time to dry in the sink. She folded towels with straight edges. She moved through the rooms like water passing through cracks in stone, making no sound, leaving no trace, taking up no more space than necessary. If you didn't look closely, you wouldn't know she was there, and that was exactly how she wanted it, because 27 years had taught Wren Calloway that the safest way to stay somewhere was to make people forget she was staying there at all. Dorothy didn't forget. From the very first day, she understood that this mute girl wasn't serving because she had been forced to, but because serving was the only language she knew for saying thank you. So Dorothy didn't stop her. She let Wren cook, wipe, clean, and when Wren finished and sat down as if she didn't know what to do when there was nothing left to do, Dorothy pulled out the chessboard and told her to sit across from her. Wren didn't know how to play chess. Dorothy taught her. She taught slowly, patiently, by moving the pieces and pointing, then waiting for Wren to nod or write a question in her notebook. While teaching chess, Dorothy told family stories. Not underworld stories, not stories of guns and docks and money, but stories she would have told the daughter she never had. She told Wren that her husband used to like making Sunday breakfast and always used too much butter. She told her that when Connell was 5 years old, he was so afraid of thunder he hid in the closet and fell asleep there. She told her this house used to hold more laughter, and she missed that laughter. Wren listened to all of it with unblinking eyes, and Dorothy knew she was listening because this girl listened with her entire body, leaning forward, eyes never leaving her, as if Dorothy's words were something she was drinking after a very long thirst. Connell didn't take part in those afternoon chess games, but he knew. He knew because he began to notice that he was looking for her when he came home. Not on purpose, not for any particular reason, But when he stepped through the door, the first thing his eyes searched for was no longer the light in his mother's room, but some sign that Wren was somewhere in the house. The light in her room, her shoes beside the back door, the smell of food from the kitchen. He didn't admit that to anyone, not even to himself. One morning, he came down to the kitchen earlier than usual. She was already there, her back to the doorway, pouring coffee beside the window. He hadn't tried to step quietly, but she didn't hear him, or she heard him and didn't turn around. He wasn't sure which. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table. She turned, paused for one beat when she saw him, then sat across from him. The two of them ate breakfast in silence. Not awkward, not heavy. The silence of two people who both knew what silence was and didn't need to fill it with anything. After a while, he said, without looking up, "Are you sleeping all right?" She pulled out her notebook, wrote, and pushed it across the table. He read, "Much better than before." He read that sentence twice. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he was thinking about the word before. What did before mean? How many nights in how many rooms had she failed to sleep? He nodded, pushed the notebook back, and didn't ask anything more. But she saw that he had read it twice. During those 2 weeks, things happened that Wren didn't know. She didn't know Connell had called the manager of her studio in Dorchester through an intermediary and cleared the 2 months of rent she owed, along with the next 3 months, and the manager didn't ask why, because the money came from an account no one asked questions about. She didn't know Neil followed her every time she went out to buy things for Dorothy, 2 blocks behind her. Far enough that she wouldn't see him, but close enough that no one could touch her. And she didn't know that one night at a bar in Southie, a low-level man in the organization drank too much and laughed loudly and told the whole table about the mute girl in the boss's house, saying she must be good at something besides talking if the old woman kept her around for her son. And the table laughed, and someone in the bar heard it and texted someone else, and the news reached Connell before midnight. The next morning, that man came to work and was told to pack his things and leave the organization. No one explained. No one needed to explain. In Connell Ashford's world, there were things he protected with orders, and there were things he protected with a silence that made people understand on their own, and the girl in the rear wing had become the second kind of thing, though he wasn't ready to give it a name. On the last night of the second week, Connell came home late, and on the kitchen table there was a plate of food wrapped tightly as there was every night, and a note in that same rounded handwriting as there was every night. And after he read it and folded it, this time he didn't put it into his jacket pocket. He opened the drawer of the desk in his room and placed the note inside, beside 7 other notes from her that he had folded and kept over the past 2 weeks. 1 note each night, round and even handwriting on notebook paper. Her voice sent to him in ink instead of breath, and he closed the drawer, and he knew exactly what he was doing, but he still wasn't ready to give it a name. Perry Holt walked into the Beacon Hill mansion at 6 o'clock on Thursday evening, the way he had every Thursday for the past 15 years, because dinner with Dorothy was a ritual he never missed, not because it was only a meal, but because it was the way he held his place in the family. Close to the mother meant close to the son, and close to the son meant close to power. Perry was 42 years old, tall, thin, hair combed back. His suit always fitted down to the millimeter, and he had the face of the kind of man you trusted the first time you met him, and then spent 10 years realizing you shouldn't have. He had been Connell's financial advisor since Connell was a young man, when the Ashford empire had just lost its head, and the son had to carry everything after his father's death, needing someone older who knew how to count money and knew how to hide money. Perry had done both things well for 15 years, or at least it looked that way, and he had grown used to being the second most important person in every room Connell entered. So when he walked into the kitchen that evening and saw Wren placing a bowl of porridge in front of Dorothy, saw Dorothy holding that girl's hand and smiling, saw a girl in cheap clothes sitting in the chair where, for 15 years, no one but him and Connell had been allowed to sit. Perry didn't need to know anything more to know he didn't like this girl. Dinner went on normally. Dorothy introduced Wren to Perry in the warm voice she reserved for people she considered family. "This is Wren. She's staying with me. She saved my life." Perry smiled, shook her hand, said it was very nice to meet her, and that smile was so perfect that only someone used to reading false smiles would recognize that it never reached his eyes. Wren nodded in greeting and returned to the kitchen because she placed herself in the position of a servant, not a guest, and Perry watched her with the look of someone assessing a threat instead of a human being. After dinner, Dorothy went back to her room early because she was still tired. Perry and Connell remained in the study with whiskey, and this was when Perry spoke honestly. He didn't circle around the subject. Perry never circled around anything with Connell because he knew Connell hated people who did. He said, "You brought a mute homeless girl into your mother's house. Do you know who she is? Do you know where she came from? Do you know what she wants?" Connell didn't answer. He looked at Perry over the rim of his whiskey glass and stayed silent. The kind of silence Perry had learned 15 years earlier was more dangerous than any answer. The kind of silence that meant, "I heard you, and I don't need your opinion, and if you say one more thing, you'll wish you hadn't." Perry swallowed the rest of the sentence along with a mouthful of whiskey. But Perry wasn't the kind of man who stopped just because he had been warned by silence. He simply changed tactics. Over the next 2 weeks, every time he came to the mansion, he tested Wren. He tested her the way a man did after living among secrets for 15 years, and knowing that the quickest way to read a person was to set a trap and see if they stepped into it. The first time, he left an envelope on the living room table when he went to wash his hands. An envelope stamped with the name of the shell company Connell used for the real estate side, one corner left open just enough to reveal a line of numbers inside, and he stayed away longer than necessary before coming back to observe. Wren passed that envelope 3 times in 10 minutes. She didn't look at it, didn't stop, didn't slow her step. She walked past it as if it were a vase, or a book, or anything else that had nothing to do with her, because it truly had nothing to do with her. The second time, Perry spoke directly to Wren in the kitchen, while Dorothy was taking her afternoon nap. He asked her questions he knew she couldn't answer with her mouth, and he asked them quickly, one after another, without waiting for her to write. "How long have you been here? How long do you plan to stay? Do you know what Connell does? Do you know what kind of family this is?" He asked, as though interrogating her, relentless and sharp, to see if she would panic or get angry, or let something slip across her face. Wren stood beside the sink, a towel in her hand, and looked at him. She didn't write. She didn't step back. She didn't look away. She looked at him with eyes so calm that Perry felt as if he was the one being read, not her. Then she turned back to the sink and continued wiping the dishes as if he had never opened his mouth. The third time, he left a file marked confidential on the dining table, right where Wren usually sat while setting out Dorothy's bowls and dishes. The file lay there all afternoon. When Perry checked it again, it was still in the same place, at the same angle. Not one page turned, not one fingerprint on the plastic cover. She didn't even move it aside to wipe the table. She wiped around it. That evening, Perry stood in the hallway and watched Wren carry a tray of tea into Dorothy's room, her steps light, her back straight, not turning to look at him even though she certainly knew he was standing there. She disappeared behind Dorothy's door, and Perry remained alone in the hallway of a mansion he had been entering and leaving for 15 years. And he thought, a person who wasn't curious about secrets was either a saint or far more dangerous than what he was seeing, and Perry Holt didn't believe in saints. The noise came from the back door at 11 o'clock at night, not a knock, but the sound of a shoulder hitting wood, the sound of someone groaning, and the sound of Neil shouting to open the door. Connell came down the stairs in 30 seconds and saw Tommy Novak being carried into the kitchen by Neil and another lower-level man, his face white as paper, his shirt black, but even blacker with wetness around the left side of his abdomen. And when Neil laid him on the marble island in the middle of the kitchen, Connell saw that the knife had already been pulled out, but the wound was still bleeding, steady, red, soaking through the cloth someone had pressed against it, though not tightly enough. Tommy was 19 years old, the son of Connell's dead uncle, the last child carrying the family's blood besides Connell himself. He had been stabbed during a debt collection in Southie that had gone wrong, and the knife belonged to one of Garrett Shaw's men, which meant taking him to the hospital meant opening a police file, which meant opening a war in the newspapers, the kind of thing Connell couldn't allow to happen. Not yet. Neil called Dr. Paul Langford. Langford was in London, and the earliest flight was still 14 hours away. Neil called the backup underground doctor. 40 minutes, the man said. Traffic. Tommy lay on the marble island. Wren had wiped clean that very morning before setting out bowls and dishes for Dorothy's breakfast, and his blood ran through the gaps between Neil's fingers as Neil pressed the wound, and 40 minutes was too long. Everyone in the room knew it. Connell stood beside the island, his face unchanged, but his right hand had curled into a fist, and he kept it inside his pants pocket so no one would see. Because in this world, a boss wasn't allowed to tremble. A boss wasn't allowed to be afraid. And most of all, A boss wasn't allowed to let his men see him tremble or fear. But the boy on the island was his own blood, and he was bleeding out on marble. Then Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway. No one had called her. She had been in the rear room and heard the noise, and she came because that was the instinct Ruth Ann had carved into her. When you hear someone in pain, you go. No invitation needed. She looked at Tommy on the island, looked at the blood, looked at the stab wound, looked at Neil's hand pressing in the wrong place, 2 centimeters too far to the right from where pressure needed to be. Then she looked at Connell, and her eyes said what her mouth couldn't, as clearly as if she had shouted it across the room. "I know what to do." Connell looked at her. 1 second, 2 seconds. He was weighing it, placing the life of the only boy carrying the family name in the hands of a mute 27-year-old girl he knew through 10 pages of a file and 8 notes in a drawer. He nodded. Once. Once was enough. Wren washed her hands in the kitchen sink, fast, thorough, up to the elbows. Exactly the way Ruth Ann had taught her. She opened the old medical bag she always kept in her backpack, the worn leather bag Ruth Ann Porter had left her on the day she died, and inside were needles, surgical thread, hemostats, gauze, alcohol, everything arranged in its proper place, never changing position. She came to the island, gently pushed Neil's hand away and replaced it with her own, pressing in the right place, and the bleeding slowed immediately. She worked. No one in the room said a word. She cleaned the wound with alcohol. Tommy jerked hard, and Neil held his shoulders down. She checked the depth of the stab wound with a gloved finger, confirmed it hadn't pierced the intestine, only gone through muscle and fatty tissue, deep enough to kill if the bleeding wasn't stopped, but not too deep to save. She stitched. The first needle passed through Tommy's skin, and he gritted his teeth, and Connell placed his hand on the boy's shoulder from the other side of the island and kept it there, firm, silent, and that was when Wren saw something she hadn't seen before on Connell Ashford's face. Not fear, but something beneath fear. Something he hid very well, but the hand on Tommy's shoulder was speaking for him. She kept stitching. 7 stitches. Even, firm, close, 1 stitch after another, the spacing steady, the pull of the thread just tight enough to close the skin without tearing it further. She worked like someone who had stitched wounds in rooms with no surgical lights and no doctor, only 2 hands, and the calm that a dead woman had taught her when she was a 16-year-old child. And Ruth Ann had been right. Calm saved people. Panic didn't. Tommy lived. When the underground doctor arrived 40 minutes later, the stitches were done, the bandage was wrapped. Tommy was lying on the island, breathing steadily, and color had returned to his face. The doctor looked at the stitching, tilted his head, touched the edge of the bandage lightly, then turned toward the room and asked who had done this. No one answered. Wren had gone into the hallway. She was standing at the sink outside the kitchen, washing the blood from her hands, cold water running over her fingers, and she was trembling slightly, not from fear, but because her body was giving back all the adrenaline it had borrowed over the past 30 minutes. Connell stepped into the hallway. He didn't say anything. He took a clean towel from the shelf beside her and placed it on the edge of the sink, next to her hand, then walked away. No thank you. No explanation. Only a clean towel placed exactly where she needed it, exactly when she needed it, by a man who never wasted a word but always saw the right thing to see. Wren looked at the towel, then she looked at his back disappearing around the corner of the hallway. She picked up the towel and dried her hands, and she stood there a little longer in the empty hallway, alone, and she didn't know what to do with the thing beginning to form inside her chest, because she had never had a name for it. The following week, Dorothy developed mild pneumonia, a complication after the heart attack, and the doctor said it was normal in older patients but needed close monitoring. Wren didn't need anyone to tell her. She placed a chair beside Dorothy's bed and stayed there. The first night, she sat with her back straight, her hand on Dorothy's wrist, counting her pulse every hour, checking her temperature every 2 hours, changing the wet cloth on her forehead whenever the fever rose. The second night was the same. On the third night, Connell came home at 1 o'clock in the morning, passed his mother's room, and stopped at the door. Dorothy was asleep, breathing evenly, her pulse steady, and Wren was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head tilted to one side, her hand still resting on Dorothy's wrist as though even in sleep she was still counting the woman's heartbeat. She had been awake for nearly 3 days. Her body had lost. Connell stood in the doorway and looked at her. He looked at the way her head leaned and knew her neck would hurt when she woke. He looked at the dark shadows beneath her lashes. Even in the darkness, he looked at her small hand on his mother's wrist, still not letting go even when she was exhausted. And he thought that no one was paying her to do this. No one had asked her to. No contract bound her to it. She did it because she wanted to do it, and that was something he couldn't buy with all the money in the Ashford family. He entered the room quietly, took the blanket from the foot of his mother's bed, and draped it over Wren's shoulders. Carefully, slowly, the way someone sets down something fragile, afraid that too much force might wake it. Then he stepped out, closed the door without a sound, and went back to his room. The next morning, Wren woke when sunlight touched the curtains. Dorothy was still asleep, breathing evenly, the fever already down, and on Wren's shoulders was a blanket she hadn't put there herself. She knew it wasn't Dorothy because Dorothy was sleeping and had slept through the night. She knew who it was. She sat still in the chair, her hand touching the edge of the blanket, her fingers tracing the seam of the fabric, and she didn't move for a very long time, as if moving might dissolve whatever had happened during the night. Something she didn't yet dare to name. Something that felt like the first time in 13 years that someone had covered her with a blanket while she slept, and wanted her warmer instead of wanting her gone. Perry Holt met the private detective at a bar in Southie on Tuesday night, the kind of place where the yellow lights were dim enough that no one could clearly see anyone's face, and loud enough that no one could clearly hear anyone. Exactly the sort of place Perry liked to use for conversations he didn't want to exist after they ended. The detective's name was Briggs, somewhere in his 50s, a former Boston cop who had been fired for reasons no one asked about, now working for anyone who paid enough, and Perry paid more than enough. Perry said, "I need to know everything about a girl named Wren Calloway, 27 years old, currently staying in the Ashford house. Find me anything that can be used." Briggs took 1 week. When he came back to the same bar, to the same corner table, he brought a thin stack of papers and one name, Gary Nolan. Gary Nolan, owner of an auto repair shop outside Worcester. 3 years earlier, Wren Calloway had cleaned and helped with bookkeeping at his shop. A cash job, no contract, the kind of work people like Wren always did, because no one hired her officially when she couldn't speak. The IRS opened an investigation into Gary's shop on suspicion of tax evasion. 6 months later, Gary Nolan hanged himself in the garage of his own repair shop. His wife found him the next morning. The shop closed. The case closed. Wren Calloway left Worcester that same week and never came back. Perry read through the papers, and he smiled. Truly smiled for the first time in weeks, because this was what he needed. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was how the story could be told, and Perry Holt knew how to tell a story. He didn't tell everyone all at once. He understood how rumors worked inside an organization. They had to begin from the bottom up, from the smallest mouths, so that by the time they reached the people above, they had already become something everyone knew, and no one knew where it had started. He began with 2 low-level men over drinks. He mentioned Wren's name as if by accident. He said, "You know that mute girl in the boss's house? Heard that before she came here she worked for some guy in Worcester. Then the IRS came after him and he hanged himself. Strange, right?" He didn't say Wren was a rat. He didn't say she was an informer. He only placed the pieces beside one another and let the listeners assemble them for themselves. Because when people put things together on their own, they believe it more than when they're told what to believe. From 2 men, it became 4. From 4, it became 10. Within 1 week, the story had changed shape 3 times, each mouth adding a new detail as it passed through. Wren knew books, so she probably knew other things too. She was mute. Convenient, wasn't it? No one knew what she told anyone. Where had she come from that the boss would keep her in the house like that? Maybe she was someone else's eyes planted inside. Rumors in a mafia organization didn't spread like water. They spread like poison, slowly, sinking deep, and by the time you realized they were already in the blood, it was too late to draw them out. Wren noticed before anyone thought she would notice, because she had lived through this before. Not once, but 7 times. 7 foster families, and every time it began exactly the same way, not with someone saying to her face that she wasn't welcome, with smaller things, with the way people stopped looking at her when she walked past. The men coming in and out of the mansion carrying things for Connell had once nodded to her when they met her in the hallway. Now they looked away, quickly, as if looking at her meant looking at something they didn't want to be connected to. The assistant cook Dorothy had hired to prepare the main meals. The woman who had worked with Wren in the kitchen for 2 weeks and had once laughed when Wren wrote a soup recipe in her notebook for her to see. Quit on Monday morning without giving any reason except personal matters. Dorothy felt the change. She wasn't deaf, and she wasn't blind. She had lived in this world long enough to know when the air inside a house was thicker than usual, but she didn't understand why. Because no one dared say anything in front of her, because she was the boss's mother, and even the strongest rumor knew to stop at the threshold of her room. One afternoon, while the two of them were playing chess, she asked Wren, "Do you feel anything strange? Everyone in the house seems different." Wren looked at her, then wrote in her notebook, "Nothing. Everything is normal." That was the second lie Wren wrote for Dorothy, and just like the first time, Dorothy knew it was a lie. But this time she didn't ask more because she saw something in Wren's eyes that she recognized, something she had seen in the eyes of people who were about to leave. That night, in the room beside the garden, Wren opened the wardrobe and took out her backpack. She placed it on the bed and began folding clothes. Not many, because she didn't have many. Just a few pieces Dorothy had bought for her during the first week, and she folded each one carefully and placed it into the backpack, along with Ruth Ann's notebook, the old medical bag, and the little notebook she wrote in every day. She didn't cry. She never cried while packing, because tears were a luxury reserved for people who had time to be sad, and Wren Calloway had never had that kind of time. She only had time to pack, to find the way out, and to leave before someone told her to leave. Because leaving by choice hurt less than being thrown out. She had learned that lesson from the second foster family, and had never forgotten it. She zipped the backpack in the dark room, the sound of the zipper small but sharp in the silence, a motion she had made 7 times before in 7 different rooms in 7 different places, and every time, that zipper sound had meant run. Connell heard about Wooster from Neil, not from Perry, because Neil was the only person in the organization who understood that Connell needed the truth before the truth became what someone else wanted it to be. Neil came to the penthouse office on Friday afternoon and spoke briefly, as he always did. "There's a rumor spreading through the organization about Wren, about a man named Gary Nolan in Worcester, who died 3 years ago, about the IRS, about the fact that she used to do his books, and people are saying she's either a rat or bad luck or both." Connell asked who started it. Neil said it couldn't be confirmed, but it was spreading from the bottom up, and that kind of spreading usually meant someone had planted it. It didn't grow on its own. Connell didn't ask anything more. He knew that kind of spread. He also knew who had enough reason to plant it, but he said nothing about that yet. Not now, because Connell Ashford never acted before he had the full picture, and this picture was still missing its most important piece, the truth from her mouth, or in Wren's case, from her hand. He returned to the mansion later than usual that evening. The house was quiet. Dorothy was asleep. He stepped into the kitchen and saw Wren sitting at the table, the little notebook open in front of her, the pen in her hand, but she wasn't writing. She was only sitting there, staring at the blank page as if she were reading something only she could see. Her backpack lay beneath the chair at her feet. He saw that backpack and understood immediately what it meant because he had read her file, 7 foster homes, and he knew a backpack under the chair wasn't there because she had conveniently set it down. It was there because she was ready to leave. He poured coffee. He didn't ask whether she wanted any. He simply poured 2 cups the way he always did, because it had become a habit even though no one had agreed on it. He sat across from her. Silence held for a while. Then he said, not looking at her, looking at his coffee instead, his voice steady the way it always was when he said important things. "People are saying you were involved in something in Worcester. A man. A death." Wren didn't flinch. She wasn't surprised. She had been waiting for this sentence ever since the men started avoiding her eyes, and the cook quit, and the air in the house began to thicken the way it always had before, each time she was moved out of the 7 homes before this one. She put the pen down, picked it back up, then she wrote, slowly, 1 word at a time, slower than she had ever written in this house, because this time it wasn't a note about how many minutes to heat food, or whether Dorothy had finished dinner, or whether the coffee he drank had run out. This time it was something she had carried for 3 years, and had never been able to set down because no one had asked, and she didn't know how to tell it on her own. She wrote, "His name was Gary, an auto repair shop in Worcester. I cleaned and helped with his books. He paid me in cash. The books were wrong, but I wasn't the one who made them wrong. I saw the numbers didn't match, but I didn't say anything because I couldn't speak, and because he was kind to me, and because I was afraid if I pointed it out, I would lose the job, and I needed that job. The IRS came. They found everything. He lost the shop, lost the house. His wife left him. He ended himself in the garage one night in November. I stayed for the funeral. No one else stayed, just me and the gravedigger. I didn't cause it. But I didn't save him either. She placed the notebook in front of Connell and sat back in her chair, both hands flat on the table, all 10 fingers spread, as if she were holding herself in place so she wouldn't drift away. Connell picked up the notebook. He read. He read slowly, line by line, and Wren watched his eyes move over every word she had written. And she thought this was where it ended. This was where he would say thank you for being here, and after that, would come the door and the road and another town and another cleaning job and another studio apartment she couldn't afford. Connell finished reading. He set the notebook back on the table, gently, exactly where it had been. He looked at her. Then he said 2 words. All right, 2 words. Not I believe you, not I forgive you, not it's okay, just all right, in that low, even voice he used when he had heard enough and had decided and needed nothing more. He picked up his coffee, stood, walked to the kitchen window, and stood there looking out at the dark garden. He said nothing else, asked nothing else, didn't turn back to look at her. And precisely because he didn't turn back to look, Wren finally did the thing she hadn't done when she packed her things into her backpack the night before, hadn't done when the men avoided her eyes, hadn't done when the cook quit, hadn't done for the past 13 years through 7 families, and more than a dozen jobs and hundreds of nights alone. Her eyes filled. She didn't cry out loud because she had no voice, but tears fell onto the wooden table. One drop, then another, and she sat there with both hands still flat on the table, and she didn't wipe them away because she didn't need to hide in front of the man who had turned his back and wasn't looking. And that was the most honest thing she had ever done in this house. More honest than every line she had written. More honest than every meal she had left for him at 2 o'clock in the morning. More honest than every rounded handwritten note in his drawer. 2 tears on the kitchen table of the man who had just read the worst thing about her and said all right, then turned away to drink his coffee as if she had simply told him tomorrow's weather. The attack came at 2 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Not with guns or men, but with code. The kind of war Garrett Shaw liked best, because it left no blood on the floor and no evidence for the police. Shaw's hacker breached the Ashford financial system through a vulnerability in the server of the Shell Real Estate Company, and within 40 minutes, 17 accounts were frozen, 3 international transfer routes were locked. The cash flow into the port was completely paralyzed, and the computer screens in the penthouse office flashed red warnings like the heartbeat of a dying body. Neil called Connell. Connell called Perry. Perry didn't pick up the first time. He didn't pick up the second time. The third time, he answered, and in his voice there was something Connell had never heard in 15 years. Fear. Not fear of Shaw, not fear of the hacker, but fear of something else, something Connell hadn't seen yet but had already begun to smell. The emergency meeting was held at 4 o'clock in the morning in the penthouse. Perry arrived with a white face and hands that trembled slightly as he opened his laptop. He said the system had been breached. He said the damage was serious. He said they needed time to assess it. And he said all of that faster than usual, with more words than usual, because Perry Holt was trying to bury something under a pile of language, and Connell knew that people who talk too much were usually people hiding something. But Connell didn't say anything yet. He sat at the head of the table, listened, and waited. Perry didn't know that while he was panicking over Shaw's hacker, the thing truly keeping him awake wasn't the damage from outside, but his own books. 3 years. For 3 years, Perry had been siphoning money from Ashford Shell accounts, a little at a time, small enough that no one noticed, steady enough to become a number that, if someone truly good with figures looked closely, would show the hole immediately, the way rot shows inside a white tooth. And now Shaw's hacker had torn the system open. Everything was exposed. Every account was being examined. And if Connell hired anyone skilled enough to assess the damage, that person would see not only Shaw's tracks, but Perry's as well. 3 years of tracks, and Perry wouldn't just lose his job. He would lose everything. Because in this world, stealing from the boss wasn't a matter of being fired. It was a matter of disappearing. So Perry did something that 3 weeks earlier he would never have imagined himself doing. He went to Wren's room, 11 o'clock at night. He knocked on the door of the room beside the garden, the private door Connell had arranged, and he stood there under the yellow hallway light, like a man whose arrogance had carried him halfway and whose fear had carried him the rest. Ren opened the door. She looked at him. The man who had cornered her with questions in the kitchen, who had planted document traps all over the house, who had whispered to the whole organization that she was a rat, was now standing outside her room at 11 o'clock at night, with the eyes of someone who needed something from the very person he had tried to destroy. Perry spoke quickly, tightly. He needed her to look at the books, fix them, put them in order. He said Shaw had ruined everything, and they needed someone who understood numbers to sort it out before Connell saw the full picture. He didn't say he needed her to hide anything. He didn't have to say it. She understood. Ren looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she pulled the notebook from her coat pocket, wrote, and held it up for him to read. "I'll look at the books, but I'll look for Connell. Not for you." Perry read the line, and his face changed, slightly, only for a blink, but enough for Ren to see, because she had lived 27 years reading people's faces instead of listening to their words, and she never read wrong. He walked away without saying anything more. Ren closed the door. She sat at the small desk in her room, opened the laptop Dorothy had bought her the week before so she could watch movies, and began. Neil had sent her access to the financial system from the night Connell said all right, because after that evening, Connell had said one sentence to Neil that Neil didn't question. Let her see anything she needs to see. Ren opened the books, and she saw. She saw the damage from Shaw, clear, obvious, like Tommy's stab wound on the kitchen island, open and bleeding. But she also saw something else. Something that wasn't Shaw. Something that had been there long before Shaw. Small withdrawals, steady, every month, from 6 different shell accounts, rotating. Never from the same account 2 months in a row. Never large enough to trigger an alert, but when she added them together over 3 years, the total was a number big enough to buy 2 houses in Beacon Hill. Ruth Ann had taught her that numbers didn't know how to lie. Only people who use numbers did. And Ren Calloway only needed to read a balance sheet once to see every lie, and she had seen it. She worked until 4 o'clock in the morning. She didn't write the report on the laptop. She wrote it by hand, on lined paper, in the same round. Even handwriting Connell had grown used to reading on the little notes beside his plate of food at 2 o'clock in the morning. She wrote 2 sections. Section 1 was the damage from Shaw. Every account, every number, every breached pathway. Section 2 was Perry Holt. Every withdrawal, every date, every account, 3 years, not a single line missing. The next morning, she placed the report on Connell's desk in the penthouse. Connell arrived at 7 o'clock. He saw the stack of papers. He sat down and read. He read Section 1 and nodded, because that was what he had expected. He read Section 2 and stopped. He read it again from the beginning. Then he closed the stack of papers, placed both hands on the desk, and sat still for 1 minute. He called Perry into the office at 9 o'clock. Neil stood outside the door. The door closed. Connell placed the report in front of Perry and said, his voice no louder than the voice he used to order coffee, "She found in one night what I paid you for 15 years to keep clean." Perry looked at the report, looked at the round handwriting, looked at the numbers he had hidden for 3 years laid out on lined paper by the hand of the mute girl he had tried to destroy. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Connell said, "Leave Boston before tonight." Perry stood and walked out, and he didn't look back. And Neil opened the door for him and closed it behind him. And that was the last time anyone in the Ashford organization saw Perry Holt. That week, Dr. Langford returned from London. He came to the mansion to examine Dorothy and check on Tommy, and everything was normal. But when he asked Connell whether he needed anything else, Connell only thanked the doctor and said nothing more, because the role Langford had once held. The only person in the house who knew how to treat wounds and check a pulse and keep people alive had been quietly replaced by a 27-year-old mute girl without anyone appointing her. The following Monday, Connell led Ren up to the 42nd floor, through the penthouse hallway, and stopped in front of a door beside his office. He opened it. Inside was a small office. New desk, new chair, new laptop, fingerprint lock on the door. He said, "This is your office. If you need anything, tell Neil." Then he stepped into his own office and closed the door. Ren stood at the threshold of the office and looked in. White desk, leather chair, a window overlooking the Boston skyline, the Charles River, and farther beyond, Cambridge. She stepped inside. She set her backpack down beside the foot of the desk, and for the first time, she didn't set it down as if she would pick it up again right away. Didn't set it down like she was ready to run, didn't set it down like 7 foster homes and more than a dozen jobs and hundreds of rooms she had left behind. She set it down and left it there, then sat in the chair, opened the laptop, and began to work. And the backpack stayed still beneath the desk as if it, too, knew that this time was different. Garrett Shaw knew about Wren before the week was over. In Boston's underworld, the news that Perry Holt had been removed from the Ashford organization spread faster than anyone wanted, and with it came the question of who had replaced Perry, who had uncovered 3 years of corruption that no one in the entire organization had seen. And the answer led to a 27-year-old mute girl who, 2 months earlier, had still been picking up crushed tomatoes at Haymarket. Shaw didn't care who she was. Shaw cared what she knew. And she knew too much. She had read the entire Ashford financial system in one night, which meant she knew every account, every route, every shell company, every number Connell used to keep the empire standing. And if she knew Ashford's system, then she had also seen Shaw's tracks in the hacker attack, which meant she knew where Shaw had struck from, what he had struck with, and where he was weak. That girl was a living map of both sides, and Shaw wanted that map gone or belonging to him. It happened on Thursday afternoon. Wren was walking back from the pharmacy on Charles Street, 4 blocks from the Beacon Hill mansion. She had bought gauze and antiseptic to restock Ruth Ann's medical bag, because she had used nearly everything when she stitched Tommy. Neil should have been with her, but Neil was handling a shipment at the port, and Wren had left the house before anyone could arrange a replacement. She walked alone. She had been used to walking alone for 27 years, and she didn't think 4 blocks was far enough for anything to happen. She was wrong. They came from behind her. 2 men, fast, professional, not saying a word. One blocked her from the front, the other shoved her down from behind. Her knee hit the sidewalk, the same knee scraped that day at Haymarket, and she heard fabric tear when someone yanked the backpack from her shoulder, pulling so hard that the strap cut across her coat. She didn't scream because she couldn't scream. She fell face first onto the curb, and by the time she lifted her head, they were already running. 2 dark shadows turning the corner and vanishing with the backpack that held her clothes. The gauze, the old medical bag, and Ruth Ann Porter's notebook. The notebook Ruth Ann had written in throughout 30 years of practice. Every medicine formula, every patient note, every lesson she had wanted to pass on. The notebook she had placed in Wren's hands on the day she died and said, "Keep this, child. You're going to need it." The only thing in this world that proved someone had once loved Wren Calloway enough to leave her an inheritance. A passerby called the police, but Wren had already stood and left before they arrived because she didn't want the police asking questions she couldn't answer out loud, and because she knew the police wouldn't find the backpack, and because what she had lost wasn't something the police would understand. Neil found her 20 minutes later, sitting on the sidewalk in front of the mansion gate, both arms wrapped around the empty space in front of her chest, exactly where the backpack had been, as if she were holding something invisible, or as if she hadn't yet managed to tell her body that it was gone. Her knee was bleeding through the fabric of her pants. She didn't look up when Neil arrived. Neil called Connell. Connell was at the penthouse. He listened to Neil for 15 seconds, then set the phone down, and the room around him became very still. The kind of stillness Neil had learned in 7 years working for Connell was the most dangerous kind, the stillness before the storm, the stillness Neil had last heard on the day Connell discovered who had shot his father. Connell reached the mansion in 10 minutes, faster than ever. And he didn't go upstairs to his mother's room first. He went straight to Wren's room. She was sitting on the bed, her hands clean because she had washed them, her knee already bandaged by herself with a wet towel, and she was looking at her own hands in her lap, open, empty, holding nothing, and that was the image that made Connell stop at the door, because he was used to seeing her hands always holding something, a pen, a notebook, a towel, a spoon, a sewing needle. Her hands were always doing something, and now they were empty, and she was looking at them as if they had lost the most important thing they had ever held. He stepped inside, sat down beside the bed, not on the bed, but on the floor beside her, closer than he had ever sat to her before. He asked, his voice low, "What did they take?" She pulled the small notebook from her coat pocket. The notebook she wrote in every day was still with her, because it had been in her coat pocket, not in the backpack. And she wrote, "Ruth Ann's notebook," just that. 2 words Connell read and immediately understood didn't mean just that. It meant everything, because he had read her file and knew who Ruth Ann Porter was. the only person in 27 years who had kept Ren long enough to teach her how to live, and that notebook was the last thing left of her, and now it was in the hands of Garrett Shaw's men. Connell said, "I'll get it back." And then Ren did something she had never done before. She reached out and grabbed his sleeve. Not his hand, his sleeve, the fabric of his suit at the wrist, gripping it with small, cold fingers, and she held on tight. It was the first time she had touched him. In all the weeks she had been in this house, through all the meals, all the notes, all the cups of coffee, set a hand's breadth apart on the kitchen table, she had never touched him, and he had never touched her, except through the blanket and a layer of cloth. Now her fingers held his cuff, and she shook her head, her eyes saying, Don't start a war over an old notebook. It's not worth it. I'm not worth it." Connell looked at her hand on his sleeve. Then he looked into her eyes. "Worth it," he said. One word. Then he stood, and her hand slipped from his sleeve, and he walked out of the room. 48 hours later, Ren woke in the morning, and on her pillow, beside her head, was Ruth Ann Porter's notebook. The worn brown leather cover, the curled corners, the yellowed pages, the smell of old herbs and old ink. Not one new scratch, not one missing page, whole and intact, as the day Ruth Ann had placed it in her hands for the last time. She didn't know what Connell had done during those 48 hours. She didn't know who had spoken to whom, who had met whom, what had been traded or threatened or taken so this notebook could come back. She didn't need to know. She picked up the notebook, pressed it to her chest, and sat still on the bed in the room beside the garden, holding it there where her heart was beating for a very long while. Then she looked down at the pillow and saw one more thing. A small piece of paper folded in half, not notebook paper but stationery, and the handwriting on it wasn't her round, even script, but sharp, angular, leaning to the right, handwriting she had never seen before but recognized at once as his. "Don't go anywhere without Neil." She read that line. Read it again. Read it a third time. She folded the paper along its original crease, read it once more, then folded it again, and she placed it beside Ruth Ann's notebook on the headboard, the two things lying side by side, the notebook of the woman who had taught her how to live, and the note from the man who had just walked into the dark to retrieve what she had lost. And she knew these were the only two things she would never let herself lose. And she read the note one last time until the crease had softened in the white paper, and every stroke of his handwriting had carved itself into her memory, deeper than any number she had ever read. The charity party at the penthouse was the annual event Connell hosted every fall, on the surface to raise funds for Boston Children's Hospital. But beneath that surface, it was an unofficial meeting among allies, partners, and people who needed to know that the Ashford family was still standing after Shaw's attack. 300 people, golden lights, expensive wine, a string quartet in the corner, and every smile carried at least two meanings. Dorothy came to Ren's room at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with a garment bag hanging from her hand. "You'll wear this tonight," she said. Not in the voice of someone asking, but in the voice she used when she had already decided, and Ren had learned that there was no room for negotiation behind that voice. Inside the bag was a dress, black, simple, falling past the knees, boat neck, no stones, no sequins, nothing that screamed, "Look at me." Dorothy had chosen it because she understood that Ren didn't need anything sparkling. She needed something that allowed her to appear without forcing her to perform. Ren looked at the dress. She hadn't worn a dress since Ruth Ann died, and even before that, she hadn't worn many because there had been no occasion and no money. She put it on. It fit. Dorothy looked at her, and her eyes did something Ren wasn't used to. They softened, the kind of softness Ren had seen mothers give their daughters in clothing stores, but no one had ever looked at her with that kind of gaze. Dorothy adjusted the collar for her and said, "You're beautiful, child," and Ren stood still and let her fix it, because she didn't know what to do when someone called her child and told her she was beautiful in the same sentence. The party began at 7 o'clock. Ren went down with Dorothy, half a step behind her, and when the elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor, the noise and lights and smell of perfume rushed over her like a wave. She was beautiful. That was the first thing the whole room saw, even though she didn't want them to see it. Not dazzlingly beautiful. Not beautiful like the other women in the room with diamonds and red lipstick and professionally styled hair. It was a different kind of beauty, the kind the simple black dress only framed around something that had been there from the beginning, but had been hidden beneath old coats and work pants and dust from the Haymarket floor, and now that nothing covered it anymore, it was simply there, the collarbone slightly showing beneath her skin because she was still thinner than she should have been. the large, quiet eyes in the middle of a noisy room, and the way she stood, straight, closed in, taking up as little space as possible, the posture of someone used to being invisible. And that very invisibility made her stand out more than anyone else in the room. But Ren didn't know she was beautiful, and even if she had known, she wouldn't have cared, because beauty had never saved her from anything. She stood at the edge of the party, beside the glass door looking out onto the balcony, exactly where she always stood, everywhere she had ever been, at the edge, closest to the exit, able to see the whole room while no one needed to see her, the posture of someone who had learned that the center was dangerous and the edge was safe. Dorothy was drawn into a conversation with a senator's wife. Neil stood by the elevator doors on duty. Ren was alone. She watched the party through the glass and thought about what she must look like here, like a vase someone had placed in the wrong room, beautiful but not belonging, and she was considering retreating to her office when she felt someone stand beside her. Connell. He didn't come from the crowd. He came from the balcony, as if he had already been out there and had come back in when he saw her standing by the door. He stood beside her, hands in his pants pockets, looking out at the party in the same direction she was looking, and he said nothing, and the silence between them had become something that needed no explanation. Then he said, "Come outside," not an order, not a question. An offer they both knew she would accept because there was wind on the balcony and not 300 pairs of eyes. They stepped out. The wind from the Charles River blew up to the 42nd floor, cold and clean, carrying the smell of water in autumn. The city of Boston stretched beneath their feet, lights, bridges, the river, and farther away, the flickering rooftops of Cambridge. Ren stood beside the railing, the wind lifting her hair, and she took her first deep breath since the party had begun. Connell stood beside her. Not too close, not too far. The distance the two of them had taken 2 months to find, close enough to know the other person was there, far enough that no one had to explain why. Silence held for a while. Then Connell said, not looking at her, looking at the city, "My mother invited you to stay." A pause. "I'm asking you to stay." Another pause. "They're different." Ren turned to look at him. He was still looking at the city. Then he turned to look at her, and this time he didn't look quickly, didn't glance, didn't look at her the way he looked at everything else in life, calculating and assessing. He looked at her directly, slowly, with eyes that had witnessed the worst things this world could offer and still hadn't blinked, but were looking at her as if she were the only thing he hadn't yet figured out how to handle. He said, "You give me quiet. In the world I stand in, nothing is more expensive than that." Ren looked at him. The wind blew. The sound of the string quartet drifted through the glass door. She pulled the notebook from the pocket of her dress. Dorothy had sewn pockets into it because she knew Ren needed her notebook the way other people needed their phones, and she wrote, slowly, because her hand wasn't completely steady. "I don't have a voice. I don't have a family. I don't have anything to give you that's worthy of the world you stand in." She handed him the notebook. He read it. He folded that page gently, along the crease, and put it into the pocket of his suit jacket, the same pocket where he had put her first note at 2 o'clock in the morning in the dark kitchen weeks ago, the same pocket that had held every piece of paper she had ever written for him, every piece he had folded and kept and never thrown away, and Ren watched him place the words she had just written into his jacket pocket, beside all the words before them, and she understood that he had kept everything, every scrap, every line, every word she had written to him in ink on paper. He had kept her voice in the place closest to his chest. He held out his hand, not taking, not pulling, only open, palm turned upward, fingers slightly curved, waiting, the hand that had signed orders and made threats, and kept an empire standing now, opening to her as if she were the only thing in the world that hand didn't know how to hold by force, and could only wait for. Ren looked at his hand. Then she placed her own inside it, small inside large, cold inside warm, light inside heavy. He closed his hand around hers, slowly, firmly, and they stood on the balcony of the 42nd floor, with Boston beneath their feet, and the wind from the Charles River, and the sound of the string quartet behind the glass door, and a party of 300 people inside, none of whom knew that the two of them were standing outside in the dark, holding hands, and for the first time in 27 years, Ren Calloway was no longer standing at the edge. She was standing beside someone, and someone was holding her hand, and neither of them rushed back inside. Garrett Shaw's offer came through an intermediary on Monday morning, A lawyer everyone in Boston knew was Shaw's mouth whenever Shaw didn't want to open his own. The lawyer met Neil at a cafe on Newbury Street and spoke briefly. Mr. Shaw wanted peace, Mr. Shaw was willing to withdraw from the port and return the frozen accounts. And Mr. Shaw had only one condition. Hand over the girl. Hand over Wren. Because she knew too much. Knew Ashford finances from the inside out. Knew Shaw's attack route from the outside in. She was a living map of both sides, and Shaw couldn't allow that map to remain in his enemy's hands. Neil brought the offer back to Connell. Connell was sitting at his penthouse desk, morning light from the window falling across his face, and after he heard Neil finish, he didn't need time to think, didn't need to weigh profit against loss. He said no, one word, and Neil nodded, because Neil had known the answer before he asked. That no opened a week that people in the organization would later call the Black Week. Shaw wasn't used to being refused, and he answered in the language he knew best, calculated violence. On Tuesday, 2 Ashford men were beaten on their way home in Charlestown, not killed, but left with broken bones, enough to send a message. On Wednesday, Conley Terminal was hit with a surprise, customs inspection everyone knew Shaw had paid for. 3 containers were held, and the cash flow from the port froze completely. On Thursday, an Ashford restaurant in the North End was set on fire at 3 o'clock in the morning. No one was hurt, but the restaurant burned to the ground, and the message was clear. I can touch anything that belongs to you. On Friday, Neil was followed from the mansion to the penthouse by 2 cars he recognized at once as Shaw's men. No attack, only following, only to say, "We know where you go and we know who is inside the house you're protecting." Wren knew. She knew because she wasn't deaf, and she wasn't blind. She saw Connell coming home later each night, with his jaw tighter each night. She saw Neil taking more phone calls and speaking in a lower voice. She saw Dorothy worrying, even though the older woman tried to hide it, and she saw the new reinforced glass being installed on the windows of her room without anyone explaining why, and she knew it was all because of her. Because she had opened the laptop and read the books and written the report and exposed Perry, and now she knew too much, and everything was burning because of her. Men were beaten because of her. The port was locked down because of her. The restaurant burned because of her. She sat in her office on the 42nd floor, looking at the spreadsheets on the screen, and she no longer saw numbers. She saw fire and broken bones and the 2 cars following Neil, and she thought, this is Worcester again. This is Gary Nolan again. Wherever she goes, that place catches fire, and she can't save anyone. And the only way to put out the fire is for her to leave. 3 o'clock on Saturday morning. The house was dark. Dorothy was asleep. Connell hadn't come home yet, or he had come home and was somewhere she didn't know. Wren sat at the kitchen table, the small counter light on, her notebook open in front of her, and she wrote. She wrote the longest letter she had ever written in her life, longer than the financial report for Connell, longer than anything she had ever put down with a pen, because this letter was for Dorothy, and Dorothy deserved to hear everything Wren couldn't say with her mouth. She wrote, "Thank you for holding her hand on the stretcher that day at Haymarket." She wrote, "Thank you for teaching her chess and telling her stories about Dorothy's husband making Sunday breakfast." She wrote, "Thank you for sewing pockets into the dress because Dorothy knew she needed her notebook." She wrote that Dorothy was the second woman in her life, after Ruth Ann, who had made her feel like a human being instead of a shadow passing through other people's lives. And she wrote that she was sorry because she had to go, because if she stayed, everything Dorothy loved would keep burning, and she couldn't bear that. She couldn't bear one more person being hurt, because she had existed near them too long. She set the pen down, folded the letter, left it on the kitchen table, exactly where she always left Connell's plate of food every night. She went back to her room, picked up the backpack she had packed the day before, Ruth Ann's notebook and Connell's handwritten note lying side by side in the innermost pocket, and opened the private door to the garden. Connell was standing outside the door. He stood there in the dark, his back against the brick wall, his hands in his coat pockets, watching her step out, as if he had known the exact moment would come, because he had known, because he had read her file, 7 foster homes, and he knew Wren Calloway ran before she was thrown out. Always. And he had stood outside this door every night that week, waiting for the night she would open it with a backpack on her shoulder. Wren stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. The backpack on her shoulder. The letter on the kitchen table. 3 o'clock in the morning. The dark garden, and the 2 of them facing each other at the threshold he had designed to control her, and was now using to keep her from leaving. He stepped toward her. Not fast. Not slow. He lifted a hand and took the backpack from her shoulder, gently, pulling the strap over her arm, the way someone removes a burden from a person who has carried it too long. He set the backpack on the ground beside her feet, and he said, in a low, ordinary voice, as if he were asking whether she had eaten breakfast, "I handled Shaw. It's done. Since last night." Ren looked at him. She didn't understand right away. Or she understood but didn't believe it because she wasn't used to someone solving problems for her. She was the one who solved her own problems in the only way she knew, by running. But he was standing here, and the backpack was on the ground, and he had said it was done, and his eyes weren't lying. She had read enough eyes in her life to know when someone was lying, and Connell Ashford didn't lie. He had done whatever he had done over the past 48 hours to make Shaw stop, and she didn't need to know what that thing was. She only needed to know he had done it, and it was over, and she didn't need to run. And then the thing that had kept Ren standing for 13 years, the thing that had kept her silent and dry-eyed through 7 foster homes, and a dead mother, and a dead teacher, and a dead employer, and hundreds of nights alone, that thing broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. It broke quietly, the way everything in Ren's life always happened, quietly. Her shoulders shook. Tears fell. There was no sound of crying because she had no voice, but her body cried with everything it had. Shaking shoulders, shaking chest, shaking hands, and she stood there in the dark garden at 3 o'clock in the morning, crying without a sound in front of another person for the first time, because this was the first time someone was standing there for her to cry in front of. Connell pulled her in. No question, no waiting. His arms went around her back, one hand at the center of her spine, one hand behind her head, and he held her against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. And she cried into his shirt, her shoulders trembling, her hands gripping the fabric of his coat at his back as if she were afraid he would leave, even though he had just proven he was the man who stood outside the door every night waiting for her, not to stop her, but to be there if she needed someone there. They stood in the garden. 3 o'clock became 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock became 5 o'clock. The sky changed from black to gray to a pale violet along the eastern horizon. Ren stopped shaking, but she didn't let go of his shirt, and he didn't let go of her. The first light of morning touched the wooden fence, touched the maple tree that had begun to shed its leaves, touched the roof of the Beacon Hill mansion, and touched the 2 people standing in the garden, and the backpack lay on the ground beside their feet, where he had placed it, where it would stay. 6 months later, spring. Boston changed its coat. The maple tree in front of the Beacon Hill mansion had put out new leaves, tender and green, and the afternoon light was longer and warmer, touching everything with the kind of patience only spring possessed, the patience of something that had waited a long time beneath cold soil, and was finally allowed to rise. Ren Calloway sat in the office on the 42nd floor, beside Connell's office, the place where she had sat every day for the past 6 months. She managed the entire Ashford financial system, every account, every route, every number passing through her hands before it went anywhere else, and she did it with the precision Ruth Ann had taught her, and the stillness 13 years of muteness had given her. She had an office, she had a desk, she had a laptop and a fingerprint lock, and a leather chair she had sat in long enough for it to carry the shape of her. She had a life, not the life she had ever imagined, because she had never allowed herself to imagine far enough to see herself here, but a real life, with rhythm, with a place, with someone waiting for her to come home every night. Tommy visited the mansion one Sunday afternoon, grinning, beer in hand, and he lifted his shirt to show Dorothy the scar on the left side of his abdomen as if it were a medal and not a knife wound, and Dorothy scolded him to put his shirt down because it was rude, but she smiled as she said it, and Ren sat at the kitchen table watching them both, and thought that scar was her stitch line. 7 stitches on the marble island that night, and Tommy was alive and laughing, and that was enough. Perry Holt disappeared from Boston exactly as Connell had said. No one knew where he had gone. No one asked. In this world, when someone disappeared by order of Connell Ashford, the right question wasn't where did he go, but is it far enough? And the answer was always, never far enough. Dorothy called Ren child. Not from one specific day, not from one marked moment. It slipped into her language naturally, the same way Ren had slipped into this house, slowly, quietly, until it was simply there, and no one remembered when it had begun. Have you eaten, child? Go rest early, child. You stayed up late again, child. Every time Ren heard that word, something inside her paused for one small beat. A beat no one saw, because in the first 27 years of her life, no one had called her child except a woman who was dead, and now someone was calling her that again, and she was still learning not to flinch when she heard it. That evening, Wren went out onto the penthouse balcony. Connell was already there. He was sitting in the chair someone had placed there after the night of the party, 2 chairs side by side facing Boston, and he was drinking coffee and doing nothing. The greatest luxury Connell Ashford allowed himself. Doing nothing. Only sitting. Only breathing. Only looking at the city he controlled, without needing to control anything for the next 10 minutes. Wren sat beside him. No speaking. No writing. The silence between them had become its own language. A language that needed no translation, no grammar. Only 2 people understanding that silence beside someone was different from silence alone, and they had spent many months building that language. And it was the most precious thing either of them had. Wind from the Charles River, the light slowly dying along the horizon, orange, violet, deepening blue. Wren looked at the city, then she looked at Connell, then she did the thing she hadn't done for the past 13 years. The thing the doctor had said she might be able to do, but her brain had refused. The thing she had lost on the night her mother died on the kitchen floor in Worcester, when she was 14 years old, and screamed until her throat broke. She opened her mouth. The sound came slowly. It wasn't speech. Not yet. It was something before speech. Something that had been locked away for 13 years, trying to find its way out through rust and fear and silence. And it hurt. She felt the pain in her throat, in her chest, in every place those 13 years had closed. And she didn't stop because she had something she wanted to say, and she had waited long enough. One word. Hoarse. Broken. So small the wind almost carried it away, but clear enough for the man sitting beside her to hear. Stay. Connell turned. He looked at her, and his eyes, the eyes that had looked straight at everything this world had thrown at him without blinking, the eyes that had looked at his father in the morgue and Tommy on the kitchen island, and Perry's betrayal and Shaw's threats without blinking. Those eyes blinked. He reached out and took her hand. Tight. Not like that night on the balcony when he had opened his palm and waited for her to place her hand in it. This time he took it. Actively. Certainly. The grip of a man who had decided, and would never decide again. He said, "I'm not going anywhere." 4 words. And that was all. The wind blew. The city lit up beneath them. The Charles River flowed toward the sea as it had flowed before these 2 people found each other, and would keep flowing long after this story ended. And on the balcony of the 42nd floor, the woman who had once had no voice had just found the thing she had lost the longest, and she used it to say the thing she feared most, stay. And the man sitting beside her, the man the world called ruthless and cold and dangerous, held her hand and said he wasn't going anywhere, and he meant it, in every meaning those 4 words could carry. That is the story of Wren and Connell, the story of a girl who had nothing but her hands and her silence, and a man who had everything, except peace, and the way they found each other in the place no one expected. This story reminds us that sometimes love doesn't arrive through confessions or roses or perfect movie moments. It arrives as a plate of food, wrapped tightly at 2 o'clock in the morning, as a blanket placed over someone's shoulders when they have fallen asleep, as a notebook retrieved after 48 hours, as a man standing outside the door every night, not to stop her from leaving, but to be there if she needed someone. And it reminds us that every person deserves someone who says, stay, even when you think you have nothing to give, even when you think you aren't worthy, even when you have grown used to packing your backpack and finding the exit before you can be thrown out. You are worthy. Someone out there is waiting for you, not because you are perfect, but because you are you, and that is enough. If this story touched you, click like, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so we can listen to more stories together every day. We want to know how you felt when you heard Wren and Connell's story. Which moment made you pause? Which moment made your heart feel heavier? And what this story reminded you of in your own real life. Maybe sometimes you are Wren, used to running before you can be rejected. Or maybe you are Connell, loving someone through actions instead of words. Share it with us in the comments, because we read every line, and every story of yours matters. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.